let's talk about dust on the moon.
Well, if you're looking at the moon from the Earth and you realize what a very desolate place it is, it has absolutely no atmosphere and it has 1/6 of gravity. And you realize that the cosmic dust has been building up for 3.8 billion years or more on that surface. It's the same dust we get on the surface of the Earth that's incoming, and that amount of dust is enough to fill 300 million barrels of oil, or the size of Exhibition Stadium in Toronto coming in, which is a very fine layer when you spread that around the surface of the Earth. So it's enough if you wipe your finger on it, counter, you see some dust. But when you're looking at it and you realize that that dust has been building up, there's nothing there to disturb it, there's nothing to pack it down, there's nothing to wash it away, because there's no atmosphere, no rain, no ice, no anything to compress it. So it's very, very light in nature. And if you realize also that the same size of dust on the surface of the Earth with the same mass, dust is much heavier because it's absorbing moisture from the atmosphere. It could be 45, 50, 60% heavier just because of the absorbed moisture in there. And on top of that, you have a layer of atmosphere which is also continuously pressing down on it, compressing it all the time, which is 14.7 psi or 11.4 tons per square meter. So on the surface of the moon, this dust is completely undisturbed for billions of years. And that's just the cosmic radiation. And then on top of that, you have the dust that's accumulating from meteor impacts. And those major meteor impacts are on the far side of the moon. The moon faces us continuously. We're seeing the same side of it all of the time. And the Earth seems to protect the moon from meteor impacts from the side that we see. So like the Sea of Tranquility and the other flat surfaces that you see, the darker flat surfaces that you're seeing just by the visual eye, are very much undisturbed. And that dust is going to be accumulating on that side and those surfaces. And even documents from the 1930s on have stated that the dust would have accumulated that could be 10 to 15 meters deep, sitting there, left undisturbed. This very, very light dust. The other effect that happens with this very light dust, and because there's no moisture, and when the sun is shining on it, you get a photoelectric charge into that dust. And that charge is intense enough that the dust itself can levitate. And they claim that if the dust is levitating up, and we're not talking a little bit off the ground, we're talking several kilometers off the surface, that this dust levitates and stays there as long as the sun is shining on it and creating that photoelectric charge. If you touch that dust, if you kick it with your feet, even if it's only a few inches deep, it's going to stay up. It's not going to fall back down. The heavier particles will, but the very fine dust is going to be up there. There's no way to get around it. If you were driving a rover, you would just be lost in a cloud of dust. It's not going to come down. When you land, it could be weeks or months before you're able to see anything out of there because the dust that has been kicked up. It's not going to disperse. There's no wind to carry it away. There's nothing. Once you kick it up, it's going to fall down naturally. So when you're looking at the simulation photographs that NASA have produced, there is no technology at that time. I mean, CGI can do anything now, but at that time, to reproduce the effect of the lunar surface, the dust on the lunar surface, and if it's levitating off the surface, even if it only comes up a few feet from the photoelectric charge, it's going to disperse evenly down. Even if it only picked a few inches up, it's going to set down a coating like fresh fallen snow. It's going to coat everything.
But when the LEM kicked up dust, you should see some dust somewhere on that LEM, but you don't.
They claim that it just cleaned everything right off beautifully, right? That it keeps going because there's no atmosphere. When they kick it out, it could continue out and the surface would be completely clear.
Yeah, and yet on the rover, you see the rooster tails and the dust falls right back down again. the heavier particles, you don't see any of that dust just floating off.
You see it go up and hit the atmosphere. If they were heavier particles, they go up and down in a perfect arc, and you actually see it go up and hit the atmosphere and stop and then fall. That's been well documented by other people. Some people claim that shows that it's on the lunar surface, but it actually shows that it's on Earth. If you imagine that this dust has risen up with this photoelectric charge and falls down at least once a month, when you're looking at any of the photographs of the lunar surface from the Apollo record, there should be no bare surfaces. The rocks that they are displaying should have several inches of dust covering over them. It should look like a fresh blanket of snow covering everything over. There's no way you would see any detail because of the very fine dust is going to be on the top. And the fact that it's being pulled up by photoelectric charge, the lightest particles will be at the top, so it's effectively like a sieve. The heavier particles will be at the bottom, and the very, very fine ones are going to be at the top, even if it's only a few inches thick, which is going to be a lot more than that over 3.8 billion years. You could be waist deep walking through it before you found a solid surface. And when you disturb that, it's not going to come back down rapidly. And even though it was described by many scientists and well documented from MIT and Harvard and even from NASA, the documents claim the same thing. There's no way that they could actually simulate that effect. And there's no way they even attempted to simulate that effect in the photographic journal. That kind of effect with the dust being that fine and that light, if you're sitting in front of a window and you see dust in your house floating around, right? That dust is 20 times heavier with the moisture and the gravitational pull, and it's still floating around in the atmosphere. Imagine how long it would take on the lunar surface for something that's the same size. It doesn't have anything to blow it around, but it's going to take that long for it to drop back down, and it never loses wholly that photoelectric charge because there's no way to disperse it. There's no way to ground it. There's no moisture to help it bleed off.
Well, this is what they say, the Apollo 15 flag. When the astronaut walked by the flag, they say that he built up a positive charge and it was discharging on the flag when he walked by. That's what caused it to move. And the other one was they were depressurizing the LEM at the same time that astronaut walked by the flag on Apollo 15.
It's fine for them to use their knowledge to explain things when there's a phenomena like that. And then if it can move the flag from it, what's it going to do to the dust around his feet, right? It's going to be the positive charge on his suit. If it can move the flag, would be moving that dust all the time. It would be active every time he steps. You would see it in the videos all the time. That's just people trying to make excuses, saying that all of a sudden they're releasing air out and it's making the flag move or something like that. That's just all nonsense, because otherwise there'd be a blast crater that's 15 feet deep. Can't use one argument in one case and use the same argument and say it does work in the next, right? That you're just contradicting yourself all the time. And of course NASA does that continuously. And the other thing about that dust is it's going to get into everything. It's so fine, it's going to get into every fiber of their suits.
When you look at the rover's motors, you look at the back of them, and there's a hole in the back, just like you would have an air hole or an air vent where the brushes are. So that's going to get plugged up very quickly.
I haven't looked up to see who manufactured the motors in particular, but they're built like any typical motor. They have air cooling slots in them. And of course, they need to be perfectly sealed off units in there. And of course, they can't be lubricated in a vacuum either. So they're going to wear out very, very quickly. Bushings are going to wear out. There was no dry lubricants available at that time.
Magnetic dust is going to get in there.
That dust is going to get in there. And because they are already charged with an electric charge, and you turn on an electric motor, it's going to attract it to them, and it's just going to ball up with dust in there and ruin those motors completely. They probably didn't work that long while they were simulating them here at Flagstaff. They probably got enough dirt in them. They would have had to replace those things. I would imagine Grumman would be out there doing service calls when they were doing the photo shoot.
But once that dust gets in the motors, they're finished.
They would be changing the motor out, of course, right? Like those astronauts, they were using them like drag cars because they had more than one on the set at a time. And they'd be ruining everything because they didn't give a damn. It wasn't coming out of their pocket. Ever since the very first car was made, when they built the second car, they raced them. That's why GM had to give them all brand new Corvettes, because they, needed to have something that would go fast. They're supermen. They're rock stars. I don't know if you could give them an Academy Award for the acting that they did for those simulations, but certainly they should get something for their effort. So GM gave them a car. That's good enough. But that dust is going to be there. Like I said, there's nothing on the surface of the moon. It is so desolate. It is so barren. And without an atmosphere, without rain, without ice or anything to wash it down, every surface is going to be covered. You should never see a bare surface on any rock, and you see all kinds of photographs with rocks sticking up and they're perfectly clean and bare. That couldn't possibly happen if every month the dust is levitating off the surface and then falling back down again from a photoelectric charge.
You see these backyard astronomers with 14-inch telescopes, and some of these fellows are picking up lightning shooting out of what looks like crevices that are in the ground. And you'd think, well, if that's the case, then you would have quite a lot of dust being thrown up out of there too. So this seems to be a natural occurrence, so say the scientists. They agree with that as well, that there is a discharge happening. So if this discharge is happening, it's going to be expelling dust.
Oh, it's going to knock it around for sure. If it's a big enough charge, it might even turn fine dust into glass. Just like a meteor impact, when it hits hard enough, creates glass. If you look at the rover through the series of the thing, when they have to change them up on a set, especially Apollo 17, you'll sit there and look. It's a brand new rover sitting there. There isn't a spot of dust on it. Apollo 16, when they did the jump salute at the flag, the rover sitting behind it is one of a kind. It has a double rib on the one fender, which is the only shot of any rover with a double rib on the fender. And that thing is a brand new unit sitting there just for that photo shoot. There's absolutely no way when something gets dirty on the surface of the moon when they're out and about that they're going to take the time. They did not have the time. They did not have the resources to clean something back up again.
Now, what about the rover that had the different frame, 17?
Actually, you can identify it right from the frame rail. The aluminum is bent. One has a very rough weld on the back right corner in front of the wheel. It has a weld on it, and another one is very square and then has a bracket welded to it. Those things just don't happen. They aren't out there welding extra pieces on the equipment or repairing it. Those are three separate rovers. They were hand-built, and none of them are identical. And then, of course, the one rover that they keep using over and over again has a leaky wheel axle on the rear left side. And that is the Apollo 15 rover. They use it in 16 and they use it in 17. And it's well documented while they were doing simulations and practices that they had more than one piece of equipment with them when they were doing it. For example, they had 4 PLSs, like 2 extra ones for the astronauts to wear, and they always had 2 rovers on the set when they were doing the simulations. And that's well documented. I think the McKinney file is one of the ones that goes through all of the practice simulations.
It's incredible.
Yes.
It is a complete different frame.
Exactly. The thing is the sets that they were doing all the practice on for a number of years are the exact same set that they used to do the final simulations, the full dress simulations on there. And those are the videos and those are the photographs that they're using to claim they landed on the moon. the dates and times and everything are on the front of the videos, on the color chart. The date and everything is there, and that's the exact same date that the simulations were in their training. They don't match up with the date that they actually claimed they landed on the moon. All you ever saw was a very large rocket take off, disappear, and that's the last you'll see of that, because nobody other than NASA claimed that it went any farther than what we could see.
When you take a look at the rockets that Randy Walsh put in his book, right, that was the Saturn V's, weren't they?
Yes.
When he's showing these tests being conducted on the video, we can see so much flame and particles and smoke being ejected from that engine. And you can see the plume and the dust that it's kicking up and throwing all over the place. I realize it's on the Earth, but still, when you're coming down in a machine that has 6,000 pounds of thrust, let's just say that for a ballpark, because it's going to kick up dust as well. And you can see that when they're landing. You hear kicking up some dust, and then they show it in the window, and there's dust flying everywhere. But still, what gets me is there's no dust anywhere to be found on that LEM when they get out of it.
There is a difference between a jet engine and a rocket engine. And the one thing is, when you're controlling the amount of thrust, if you have a variable speed thrust on a rocket, it's the amount of fuel that you're kicking out that's giving you the thrust on it. But hypergolic fuel, when you take two liquids and stick them together and they automatically ignite on their own, the expansion rate as they burn is exactly the same, even if it's a small amount or a large amount. So the speed that it is coming out the nozzle is the same speed. A jet engine, when you slow it down, slows down. But this stuff, it comes out at that same speed. It's going to have the same blast. It just doesn't have as much thrust with it because there isn't as much volume of it. So when they come down and they say they're hovering over there and they're down to 20% throttle, that doesn't mean that the amount coming out of there has slowed down to only 20% of the speed that it's coming out of the nozzle at. It still has the same expansion. If it's expanding at 1,000 to 1 and it takes a 16th of a second or a 10th of a second or a quarter of a second, doesn't matter how long it is, right? It's actually coming out at 3 kilometers per second is exactly how fast this stuff is expanding at. And you can't slow that down. When it burns, that's how fast it expands. It's just the amount you're burning down there. And of course, they're claiming the surface area, the nozzle that it's spreading over, takes the impact away. That takes the thrust away, yes.
After they exited the LEM, you think that you would see dust. When they're doing panoramics, you think that you would see some dust hovering somewhere.
Well, you see on Earth when they light a rocket on a test platform, it doesn't slowly go out there and go. It just goes wham, out it goes. When they light it, it just goes boom, out, right? There's a big push out as it's going through. It actually pushes through its own exhaust trail out there when it initially lights, right? There's no way to speed that up and slow that down. That is the expansion of the fuel that you're looking at doing that. Now, if you take someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, I mean, he's very knowledgeable in his own right, but he doesn't know anything about rockets. If he's going to use his big tie with a Saturn V rocket on it and flash it at everybody, like I watched him do in one of his latest videos, and he's going, see the size of this rocket? Look at all that fuel. That'll get us to the moon? Well, no, it doesn't, because a Saturn V rocket is no different than any other rocket. If you make a very small rocket with a very small payload, you only need a small amount of fuel, and you need to get it into orbit. So you need to get it up there 100 miles to put it into low Earth orbit. If you have a bigger payload, you need more fuel to go up the same 100 miles. And that's exactly what a Saturn V rocket is. They had a large payload, so they needed a larger rocket to hold more fuel, but the fuel is gone when you hit 100 miles. There's nothing left. All you have is the payload.
I look at the space shuttle, and I look at that fuel tank, and I know you really can't compare the two, but one thing that gets me is when I look at that fuel tank, and they had to have 2 solid rocket boosters just to get that fuel tank off the ground. But you don't see that with the Saturn V. They just supposedly loaded that whole thing right to the top with fuel. And this thing magically just gets into low Earth orbit, yet there's no booster on that rocket to help it.
And then they go back to it with the SLS. They're back to the solid rocket boosters. If you look at the fact that the Saturn V rocket was a very big show, and they had to guarantee that it was going to be a big show and not blow up on the launch pad, and they had so many failures on the launch pad, you can well imagine that that thing may not be full of fuel to lighten the weight. They would have reduced the performance of the engines to guarantee that they wouldn't blow up. It's not likely anybody sat on top of a Saturn V rocket just because of the vibration, sound loud enough to kill people on board of that thing, and the fact that just about everything they took off the launch pad was blowing up. There's no way to test it. There's no way to prior test the engines beforehand, so they had no way to guarantee the safety of those engines when they were ignited. Those things were monsters. And when you listen to people say, well, it's that big, look at all the fuel I had. Of course I had enough to get to the moon. No, it didn't. It had enough to lift the payload to low Earth orbit. That's all every rocket does. If you have half the payload and you build a smaller rocket, if you have a quarter of the payload, you build an even smaller one, because that rocket's going to take it to low Earth orbit. Saturn V rocket had a maximum payload, so it had 7.5 million pounds of fuel on it, but that fuel is gone by the time you hit low Earth orbit. But there's nothing left of that craft to do anything with. There's no equipment. There isn't enough consumables to get you to the moon. And you need a whole lot more fuel just to escape the Earth's gravity. By the time you get to low Earth orbit, you have not reduced the gravity enough. All you've done is you got out of the drag force of the atmosphere, but you haven't done anything about the gravity. Okay, and you still need fuel to be able to pull away from the Earth to escape the gravitational force. And the movie industry has created a fact that once you hit space, you can just turn, point, and shoot and accelerate with very little fuel, energy, or anything else. And NASA has taken advantage of the fact that most people believe that that's true. They think there's no energy. You can just turn and point and go and accelerate like crazy out there with very little fuel. That's not what's happening at all. If you're driving in your car, you're not being affected by gravity if you're horizontal to the Earth driving on a car, and you don't feel the effect. If you're in space flying and you need to slow it down or turn, you do not have any frictional force like a car does. If you need to turn it, you need to use fuel to stop the direction you're traveling in one direction and accelerate in the other direction. You cannot gain anything from the speed that you're now traveling at. If you're going to make a 90-degree turn, you can't transfer any of that energy into that turn like you can in a car, where you turn the wheels and the friction of the tires on the road and the weight of the vehicle take you around and you turn a corner and you keep going. In space, you have to use fuel to slow you down, and you can't take advantage of the speed that you're moving at to do that unless it's a very, very slow curvature to maintain your initial force. And when they claim that, oh, they made a right turn and went to the North Pole and then turned again to go around the Van Allen belt, I mean, I don't know how many Saturn V rockets full of fuel you'd need to do that maneuver. If you're driving in your car, the first time you have the sensation of the weight of the vehicle is when you have to make an emergency stop. You jump on the brakes and all of a sudden, there's the weight of the vehicle. You don't actually feel it when you're just sitting in the car driving down with cruise control on, driving down the road.
Well, you have conservation of momentum.
But in a rocket, you got these huge rockets to get you there, because it takes that much energy to get you to there and get you up to that speed. And then they take a little tiny retro rocket out the side, give it a little tiny blast, and it does everything. That's like a train traveling down a train track, and all you've got is brakes off a bicycle to slow it down. You're not even going to feel the effect of those little retro rockets. They will rotate it around, but it won't change the direction you're traveling. Because if the entire thing was 130 ton that they put into space, you're just not going to change the direction of that and accelerate the speed. And yeah, you don't have an atmospheric drag on it. That's the only thing that has been removed at that point when you're in low Earth orbit. You still have the full gravitational pull. The other thing they missed is when they put 2 guys in their simulated moon landing and left 1 guy on the CSM. There's no communication between that guy on the CSM. And the reason why there isn't, because he walked off the set and went back to the hotel, had a shower, and did whatever. So he wasn't even there. They couldn't have any communication with him because he wasn't physically on the set. So for 3 days, you have 1 guy sitting in their view orbiting the moon, and yet nobody's communicating with them, and they don't have any data to prove it, and they can't pull it up now because the guy wasn't there. They never recorded anything from that guy. Apollo 11, there's 24 hours where you don't hear anything from Collins. Why wouldn't they be talking to the guy? They want to make sure he's still alive, right? No, he was off set. And when he wasn't on the set, he didn't need to be there because they were only filming the 2 guys that are doing the simulation for the lunar landing. Collins could have stayed. He could have stayed in the hotel, could have taken his wife out for lunch, or his girlfriend, or one of those Playboy bunnies that they were kicking around with. Maybe he's driving around the moon set in the Corvette, right? They didn't call him on. Didn't need to be there. So there's no communication between the guys on the ground and him and the guys at Houston. And the same thing when they were traveling to the moon. There should have been a continuous audio link with them, communicating with them every step of the way on the way. No, they decided that they're going to end the set for the day. Everybody needs to get some sleep. So they had to create the fact that all 3 astronauts slept at the same time. So on the very first mission, why would all 3 guys go to sleep, right? Well, it's because they weren't traveling to the moon. They were just doing a simulation. When they step out of the simulators, they go back to their hotel, they grab a shower, and they go for dinner, and they go to bed. If they left 1 guy awake, then they'd have to have everybody sitting there doing the audio recording and the whole 9 yards, right? So they just made sure that, oh, well, the equipment's good enough. It can operate autonomously for the 6.5 hours they're sleeping, and that way those guys can go home and get dressed up. And if you're looking at the Apollo record, and you look at Apollo 17, for instance, and you see Gene Cernan, and he's been basically 11 days in space on their trip home, and you see that he has a freshly styled haircut. It is beautifully done. And there's hairspray in there, the whole 9 yards. You can see that it's set perfectly into place in the photographs when he's coming back. And a few shots before that, his face is all dirty and his hair's all messed up. Well, he didn't do that in there. He went back, and the studio hairstylist fixed them all up for the next photo shoot.
Gee, you think the first thing they would do is have a shower?
Oh, they would have had dinner, a shower, and a few other little noogies, whatever they do.
11 days, you're out there, and you're
gonna stink like that spacecraft. Don't forget, it doesn't ventilate outside. I don't care if you got a couple of those little green pine trees hanging up somewhere that they put in your car. And don't forget, those sewage bags that they had there weren't those high-tech, the ones they are today, like on the ISS, right? It's going to get a little ripened after those been sitting there for 8 or 10 days, right?
These guys are carrying quite a load in those suits.
Yes, everything's going to get a little rancid in there.
And that's 3 guys.
In the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. Yeah, there's just so many errors when you start looking at the Apollo record. And like I say, absolutely no way would they let 3 guys on a craft, all 3 of them go to sleep at the same time and nobody at the wheel. No way. Even today, I mean, where things can operate autonomously, other than the fact that we still have to call the guy to get the satellite dish realigned. I mean, they were in barbecue mode, and that satellite dish operated autonomously all the time to stay connected to the Earth. They never lost 1 second of communication, even when they were descending to the lunar surface, when they landed on the lunar surface. You don't think that an impact would not have jarred that dish? Especially Apollo 15 had the hardest landing. And they never lost 1 second of communications the entire length of time they were there, even though they're going through that jarring force, right? Everything was fine. Unbelievable. Yet they got to have 50,000 watts to go 160 kilometers, just unreal. You get to space, everything just does the same as communications. As soon as it hits space, it's free space. It can just travel as far as it wants and it's fine. No loss of signal. The inverse square law doesn't work as soon as you get to there. I mean, all of these things don't have an effect. And if you're going to sit and lie continuously and you're going to teach our children this on a continuous basis in this fantasy world that you're creating, you won't have any real scientists left. And the ones that are brilliant will see it and they will change and decide to become doctors or lawyers instead of going into the scientific field. All the promotion you're doing, you think you're doing a fine job doing it, it's going to come back and kick you in the ass, and that's exactly what's going to happen.
One question I get a lot on the channel, and it has to do with gravity. If they're going to send a team to Mars, the first thing they're going to have to do is they're going to have a gravitational environment in that craft, because when they get to Mars, they're not going to be able to walk to that airlock.
They will atrophy unless they are kept in very top physical condition, and they need to reproduce everything that the Earth has during that journey, and that's going to be a very, very large craft to do that in.
You're going to lose muscle mass.
It would be even advantageous if you gave them more than Earth's gravity and let them develop more muscle tone and keep them in good shape to be able to get there and work in that environment when they get there. There's absolutely no way you would send anybody and compromise their physical or mental ability during the travel there and expect them to perform and or survive. And that's the same thing with Apollo. When you reduce the air pressure in their suits the way they claim they did, down to the level they claim that they reduced the air pressure in the suits, it's reducing the oxygen to a level that their cognitive skills are impaired. And why would you do that to anyone in a situation like that where you couldn't possibly help them out? They're on their own, and then you reduce their cognitive skills because you're restricting their oxygen levels that the body can absorb. It doesn't make sense. There isn't anything in the scientific processes that says, let's take this guy down to the minimum level of performance and then put him in the harshest conditions. Really doesn't make sense. Scuba divers have the same thing with nitrogen narcosis, where it has the same effect of drinking a bunch of alcohol and they start acting a little silly underwater, right? And they die. You can't have an error at 100 feet underwater because you're being silly, because you're slightly impaired in your thinking. And NASA was doing the same thing by reducing the oxygen levels, by reducing the pressure in the suits down to the point where their oxygen levels, the absorption rate of going into their body, is lessened down to the point where they can't think clearly. You would never do that on a journey like that. You wouldn't do that anywhere, and certainly not the first or second or third time. Anywhere in space, there's no way you would expect that they would say, okay, we can put you there, but you're going to be a complete idiot because we don't have the equipment to keep you alive and keep you performing at 100% rate. That's the same as traveling to Mars. If their body is going to be fatigued or reduced in capability, skills, or atrophy to the point where you can hardly function and walk around it, there's no point in doing it. Nobody in the right mind would sit there and say, yeah, well, I might not be able to walk when I get there, so we'll land anyway. You wouldn't do that. There's no scientific process that says that's a good way to go.